Felicity. Thank you very much, Felicity. Thank you, Adam, for helping us on the tech. Welcome to Professor Emily Stanback, who I'll introduce more formally in a minute. Welcome to the 2023 to 24 academic year program for the Charles Lamb Society. And this year is promising to be an extremely good one. We have Emily today, we have Sarah Loach next month, and many other distinguished speakers. So thank you all for coming. It's not the easiest time of year. I appreciate that. We've had quite a few colleagues who've had to send their apologies, but I think in the circumstances, this is a great turnout. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll begin as ever with the Elian reading, and I'd like to hand over to Felicity, who's going to give us a passage of Charles Lamb.
Yes, the Elian reading that I've chosen today is the letter of Elijah to Robert Southey. And I've chosen it because it was published in the London Magazine for October 1823. So 200 years ago. And then Lamb did rewrite a little bit towards the end, and it was reprinted in Elijah Last Essays. But this is the bit that was published London Magazine 200 years ago, and it's his expression of grief, really, at Southey's reading of his work. Sir, you have done me an unfriendly office without perhaps much considering what you were doing. You've given an ill name to my poor lucubrations. In a recent paper on infidelity, you usher in a conditional commendation of them with an exception, which, preceding the encomium and taking up nearly the same space with it, must impress your readers with the notion that the objectionable parts in them are at least equal in quantity to the pardonable. The censure is in fact the criticism, the praise a concession merely. Exceptions usually follow to qualify praise or blame, but there stands your reproof in the very front of your notice in ugly characters like some bugbear to frighten all good Christians from purchasing. Through you, I am become an object of suspicion to preceptors of youth and fathers of families. And here he quotes from Southey's Review, a book which wants only a sounder religious feeling to be as delightful as it is original. With no further explanation, what must your readers conjecture but that my little volume is some vehicle for heresy or infidelity? I'm at a loss what particular essay you had in view, if my poor ramblings amount to that appellation, when you were in such a hurry to thrust in your objection like bad news foremost. Perhaps the paper on saying graces was the obnoxious feature. I've endeavoured there to rescue a voluntary duty, good in place, but never, as I remember, literally commanded, from the charge of an undecent formality. Rightly taken, sir, that paper was not against graces, but want of grace, not against the ceremony, but the carelessness and slovenliness so often observed in the performance of it. Or was it that on the New Year, in which I've described the feelings of the merely natural man, on a consideration of the amazing change which is supposable to take place on our removal from this fleshly scene? If men would honestly confess their misgivings, which few men will, there are times when the strongest Christians of us, I believe, have reeled under questionings of such staggering obscurity. I do not accuse you of this weakness. There are some who tremblingly reach out, shaking hands to the guidance of faith, others who stoutly venture into the dark, they human confidence their leader, whom they mistake for faith, and investing themselves beforehand with cherubic wings, as they fancy, find their new robes as familiar and fitting to their supposed growth and stature in godliness as the coat they left off yesterday. Some whose hope totters upon crutches, others who stalk into futurity upon stilts. The contemplation of a spiritual world, which without the addition of a misgiving conscience is enough to shake some natures to their foundation, is smoothly got over by others, who shall float over the black billows in their little boat of no distrust, as unconcernedly as over a summer sea. The difference is chiefly constitutional. Thank you. Just a small extract there from that letter to Robert Southey.
Thank you very much, Felicity. Thank you. Okay, let's move on, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Emily Stanback to the Charles Lamb Society. Emily is Associate Professor of English at the University of Southern Mississippi, and her principal research interests include British Romanticism, of course, disability studies, and the history of science and medicine. Emily is also professionally concerned with pedagogy and has created minors at her university in disability studies and health and medical humanities. Now, her wonderful book, The Wordsworth Coleridge Circle and the Aesthetics of Disability, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2017. And if you haven't caught up with it yet, do so. It's a really fine book. Currently, Emily has two projects. One rereads long 18th century disability alongside race, and two essays from that project are forthcoming next year. The other project is currently entitled Crip Romanticism, Disability, Time, Form. Emily is also in the early stages of working on an edition of Tom Wedgwood with Tim Fulford, and we look forward to that also. So Big Charles Lamb Society, welcome to Emily Stanback. And Emily's title today is Charles Lamb and Modern Disability. Thank you.
So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. We'll see if it works. All right. Everyone can see it? Yes, awesome. Okay, here we go. So I want to start by thanking Felicity, John, Adam, and the Charles Lamb Society for pulling this event together and for inviting me to speak to all of you today. A quick image description, which is something that's common within disability studies. I am a white woman wearing green glasses with my hair pulled back, and I am wearing a teal colored button-up shirt. And I have a small bone necklace on in memory of my beloved dog, Frederick. So that is what I look like in case there are any people who are visually impaired in this audience. I also want to apologize. I usually have access copies of my talks that are available for those who would like to follow along, and I was not able to get one together. And that's partly because of my own CRIP needs and CRIP time. At the very end of this talk, I will have to speak more extemporaneously than I am comfortable with. So I thank you in advance for your indulgence in listening to me perhaps ramble more than I would like to, but the vast majority of this is scripted, so I'll be looking down until I am not, and I apologize that I don't have a copy of this talk for all of you to follow along with if it would be helpful. So I am just so thrilled to be here to speak to you today about an author who has been so beloved to me for the past 15 years. I was first drawn to romantic literature somewhat more than 15 years ago because I was interested in disability representation, and I saw so many interesting explorations of disability in romantic literature. Although I was steeped in the topic, when I first read Charles Lamb as a PhD student, he felt like a revelation. Several of Lamb's contemporaries offered me flashes of insight into disability, many of which felt as fresh as contemporary treatments of the topic. But Lamb felt to me to have built an entire ethos around disability. Lamb didn't just offer individual depictions and discrete explorations of disability, but taken as a whole, his body of work felt to me that it approached a robust theorization of disability. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's work came close, but there was something about Lamb. My basic argument in my 2016 book, which John mentioned, and which continues to inform my current work, is that disability was absolutely central to what we now think of as romanticism. In the book, I was most interested in aesthetics, how experiences of disability, but also encounters with disability, shaped aesthetic thinking, aesthetic debates, and aesthetic expression in the era. In the book, I highlighted the centrality of William Wordsworth's poetic encounters with disabled figures, from lyrical ballads characters, including Simon Lee, Martha Ray, and Johnny Foy, to prelude characters, including the blind beggar and discharged soldier. I claimed the importance of Coleridge's various symptoms and illnesses to the development of his sense of the imagination and his sense of self, as well as his poetic and epistolary voice. I examined how disability shaped Tom Wedgwood's metaphysical thinking and how, in turn, that disability-informed thought influenced Coleridge, Wedgwood, and others. I also looked at medical and scientific authors in the Wordsworth-Coleridge circle, Thomas Beddoes, John Thelwell, and Humphrey Davy. These authors, too, developed nuanced and sophisticated approaches to disability and its aesthetic dimensions. My book ended with a chapter on Lamb. This was not only because his Elia essays were written later than the other primary texts I looked at, but also because even in his earlier writing, he was developing an approach to disability that felt much more distinctly modern than the other authors that I addressed. And this is what I'd like to talk to you about today, how Lamb articulates a modern approach to disability informed by his own disability experience. In what follows, I will build on some of my readings of Lamb from my book. I'll also look at my in-progress readings of Lamb, which draw on the current projects that John mentioned earlier. My two newest essays, which should be out in 2024, are from a project on disability and race. In them, I focus on how attending to colonialism, empire, and race can significantly shift our sense of disability history, and I claim that we cannot understand 18th century race or disability without examining the two in tandem. And later on, I'll very briefly extemporize on some of the ways that I anticipate, but I'm not sure yet, that Lamb may factor into that project. My other project in progress is on romantic disability, time, and form, and it's a project that Lamb helped to lead me to. In this project, provisionally titled Crip Romanticism, I'm especially invested in disability experience, and I hope to extend my earlier claims of the centrality of disability to what we now think of as romanticism, including romantic forms such as the fragment. Later in this talk, I'll suggest some of the ways that Lamb exemplifies, explores, and interrogates what disability studies scholars call crip time, the idea that disability experience reshapes time, both on a micro level, so how things from a joke to an everyday task may take more or less time or may progress differently through time depending on a disability, and also on a macro level. So, for example, how disabled people can have life trajectories that diverge from normative life trajectories, or how disability alters one's relationship with one's own past and also with prospective futures. I'll also suggest the relationships between Lamb's disability experience and his formal experimentation. Before we get into some of my readings of Lamb's texts, I want to define some terms as I'll use them. It's a good opportunity in part because Lamb inspired much of my thinking about how to think and talk about historical instances of disability. Part of my goal in looking at romantic disability is recuperating a sense of idiocy, gout, hypochondria, scrofula, madness, melancholia, and other specific conditions as they were experienced and depicted during the era. Diagnostic and cultural categories were not the same in 1800 as they are today, nor are the broader social responses to those categories consistent over time. I find it important to discuss embodied realities in the specific terms that people like Lamb would have used. Their idiocy is not our autism. Their melancholia is not our depression. But to get at the experience and the thinking of people like Charles Lamb, I find it enormously useful to also employ contemporary disability studies terminology, which gives name to the concepts that Lamb and his contemporaries helped to develop and that we inherited, even if it took some time for the terminology to catch up. That includes the term disability and also the more recent term neurodivergence, the latter of which, like disability, can be defined differently by different people, but generally refers to individuals whose brains are wired in such a way as to make them diverge from cognitive norms. I like terms like disability and neurodivergence precisely because they bring together so many types of body minds, but body minds that share important qualities. And a quick note, I realize that the term CRIP may be jarring for some of you who are not, who don't read disability studies. And I've already mentioned CRIP time, and I'll talk about CRIP time later, but it's worth just mentioning here that within disability activism and also disability studies, the word CRIP, which was once a slur, much like queer was once a slur, has been recuperated and claimed as a marker of disability culture and disability identity. And also CRIP theory is its own branch of disability theory. So when you hear the word CRIP throughout this talk, you can think of this as disabled people choosing to name their experience and reclaim the word CRIP. And you can think of it as a marker of identity and community. So back to the script, at least temporarily. Foundational to the project of disability studies is the idea that disability is a culturally contingent category. And that means that meanings of disability vary from time to time and place to place. And even what might count as disability and who might count as disabled can also vary significantly. And a good example of this, any of you who are familiar with the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Manual for mental disorders and mental, such as depression, you may know that certain things are codified as mental disorders at one time, and then at some point they are removed from the DSM. So homosexuality at one point was in the DSM. Asperger's is no longer in the DSM. So who counts as disabled according to these standards can shift pretty dramatically over time. What I refer to as disability here and elsewhere is a type of embodiment that is pathologized, one that deviates from norms, not temporarily as in the case of acute illnesses, but in a more sustained way. Recent disability studies scholars have emphasized the importance of foregrounding embodied experience. But as a field, disability studies continues to emphasize the ways that disability is also socioculturally constructed. And one of my favorite definitions of disability that really captures, I think, this duality of disability as an embodied reality, but also socioculturally constructed, is a definition by Susan Wendell from her book, The Rejected Body, which is from 1996, but I think it's still a fresh definition. Susan Wendell wrote that the biological and the social are interactive in creating disability, and that the social response to and treatment of biological difference constructs disability from biological reality, determining both the nature and the severity of disability. So the underlying embodied reality of blindness or autism or chronic pain would still be what it is, regardless of how society responds to it. But as disability studies teaches us, social and cultural responses to disability can significantly impact a person's experience. And in many cases, the most disabling effects of something like blindness or autism or chronic pain are primarily due to sociocultural responses to those embodied realities. One linguistic and conceptual choice that I made in my book that I showed you the cover for just a moment ago that I wish I could go back on is that I was a bit timid about claiming romantic authors as disabled. In my book, I use somewhat circuitous language referring to authors' experiences of disability, or referencing how most of the authors I discussed did claim their disabilities as important identity factors. But in my newer work, for reasons I'll explore at the very end of this talk, I find it essential to claim Charles Lamb as disabled, and likewise to claim Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Clare, Tom Wedgwood, Mary Prince, and Mary Lamb, Lord Byron, and many others as disabled. I likewise have begun claiming that William Wordsworth is neurodivergent, something I'd be happy to talk to people about because it's one of my newer ideas. And in making these claims, I do see myself following the lead of the authors themselves, as well as those who knew them best. In the case of Charles Lamb, he wrote frequently about his stammer, his unusual gait, and his not infrequent debilitatingly low spirits and nervous sensibility, which he described in such a way as to link himself with melancholy. And I want to note that I've chosen what I think is the first extant portrait of Lamb to use here, in part to unmoor our associations of disability and older age, and to remind us that Charles Lamb was always disabled, and that he describes his boyhood self in terms that make it clear that he was always in a non-normative body. So I like to think of young Lamb as a stammerer, as a limper, as someone who is prone to melancholia with nervous sensibility. From the preface to the last essays of Elia by a friend of the late Elia, I messed myself up by reading something about the different pronunciations of Elia last night and practiced all of them because I switched myself. So my apologies for switching here. From this preface, Elia had an inveterate impediment of speech and would stutter out some senseless pun. From Confessions of a Drunkard, I have a natural nervous impediment in my speech. From Dream Children, I was a lame-footed boy. I could not walk for pain. And Lamb makes various references to nervous fevers and nervous sensibilities, as well as the impact of alcohol on what he calls in Confessions of a Drunkard, the weak, the nervous, to those who feel the want of some artificial aid to raise their spirits and society. And of course, many of these quotes are from Lamb's alter egos or versions of himself, but they're consistent enough that I think that he's developing a portrait of himself as variously disabled in ways that his readers will notice. These are continuities between the different personas that he creates. His letters often contain unhesitatingly frank descriptions of his mental sufferings. From a 1796 letter to Coleridge, here's a more humorous confession of madness in which he describes his own institutionalization. The 6 weeks that finished last year and began this, your very humble servant spent very agreeably in a madhouse at Hoxton. In that 1796 letter, Lamb also included a poem about his experience that he would go on to publish in Coleridge's 1797 volume of poems. Although Lamb's speaker doesn't say he was institutionalized, he does describe the error of a sickly mind and troubled thoughts clouding the purer well and waters clear of reason. Lamb's friends, acquaintances, and critics wrote about all of these qualities too. Accounts of Lamb's stammer are too numerous to list here. Thomas de Quincey described how Lamb used his speech impediment in service of his humor to add effect to his delivery. Schoolmate Valentine Legrice and Leigh Hunt both described Lamb's slow and peculiar gait in Legrice's words. And Leigh Hunt was not a classmate. That was not a reference to both of them. These qualities are all central to Lamb's sense of self, to others' sense of him, and to the various personae he created in his writing. These qualities are all disabilities. Charles Lamb is disabled. There are many ways that disability studies scholars and disability historians might distinguish between pre-modern and modern disability. Some would look to labor, the ways that industrial work created disability, but also reshaped the relationship between an individual's capacity to labor and their social identity. Others, I am among them, look to medicine and in the some ways seismic shifts brought about by the consolidation of medical authority over disabled body minds, and it should be noted non-white body minds as well. Lamb's use of scientific and medical discourse is relevant here, and we see it throughout his letters and also in his essays. And his use of medical discourse suggests his awareness of the importance of medical authority in interpreting body minds like his own and also like his sister Mary's. As historian David M. Turner has noted, those working in new disability history demonstrate that meanings of disability are not biological givens, but historically and culturally contingent. Contemporary disability studies, as I have already mentioned, also hinges on this recognition that interpretations of human variation are not natural and immutable, but rather are largely determined by context and are subject to sometimes significant revision. For David Turner, an awareness of the cultural contingency of disability is particularly modern. He writes, although distinctions are made today between impairment, loss or abnormality of physiological or anatomical structure and function, and disability, the restriction of on a person's ability to undertake certain tasks or functions, which may be caused by social and environmental factors, these distinctions may not have made much sense to people in the past. While I am not so certain that these distinctions are as broadly legible today as those of us working in disability studies might hope, it is also the case that authors like Lamb and Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Mary Shelley, and so forth spent time probing the differences between physiological difference on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ways that it is interpreted by culture, that is, the ways that it becomes disability. I trace Lamb's awareness of disability in its modern culturally contingent sense to his experiences in the wake of what he and others have called the Day of Horrors, 22 September 1796, when Mary Lamb killed their mother in what was the first of her acute periodic experiences of madness. Accounts of that day, as well as Mary's murder trial, appeared in newspapers. A note in the Morning Chronicle reported, it has been stated in some of the morning papers that she, Mary, has an insane brother also in confinement. This is without foundation. Gerald Monsman rightly reads ambiguity in the Morning Chronicle note. The "this" that is without foundation could refer to Lamb's reported insanity, his confinement at Hoxton, or both. The note therefore puts very publicly leaves Lamb's mental health in question. In a May 1800 letter to Coleridge, Lamb describes, nor is it the least of our evils that her case, that is Mary's case, and case here has that double meaning of a legal case, but also a medical case. Her case is, and all our story is so well known around us, we are in a manner marked. Lamb's use of the word marked here suggests stigma in its most literal sense, how even madness can be felt to have left a visible trace on the body. There was the Day of Horrors with its agonizing pains, and then there was the social response to Mary's madness, which added significantly to Lamb's suffering. Coleridge seems to have also contributed to Lamb's feelings of being marked through his publication of This Lambtree Bower My Prison, which makes vague reference to the murder as the evil and pain and strange calamity that Charles Lamb has endured. Scholars often overlook that when Lamb wrote in protest of Coleridge's publication of the poem, he specifically critiqued his friend's use of his proper name. This was what convinced him of what he called Coleridge's studied malice. Lamb wrote you, damn you, oops, there we go. Damn you, I was beginning to forgive you and believe in earnest that the lugging in of my proper name was purely unintentional on your part. When looking back for further conviction, stares me in the face, Charles Lamb of the India House. The same year, 1800, he explained in a letter to Thomas Manning that the city could alleviate his sense of stigma. It is a great object to me to live in town where we shall be much more private. We can be nowhere private except in the midst of London. In his 1802 essay, The Londoner, he describes how the very deformities of London, which give distaste to others, from habit do not displease me, suggesting that the city was a natural habitat for a disabled brother and sister. It is no wonder that Lamb would feel unremarkable in the metropolis. In the city, one could encounter people from various cultures speaking various languages, as well as much more spectacularly disabled people on display. And as Lamb will write about in A Complaint of the Decay of Beggars in the Metropolis, many of the city's beggars were disabled themselves. Against this backdrop, Charles and Mary Lamb were hardly remarkable. I won't repeat too much of the argument from my book in my coming remarks. In the book, I explore Lamb's theorizing of disability as part of what I call his spectacular metropolitan aesthetics, insights born, I believe, of these formative experiences of stigma in the wake of his own time in Hoxton and the Day of Horrors. But before moving on to Crypt Time, another important way that I think Lamb theorizes disability in its modern sense, I do want to briefly call attention to two examples from my book that show Lamb's modern take on disability aesthetics. The first is Lamb's 1810 essay on physiognomy from the Reflector, which is titled On the Danger of Confounding Moral with Personal Deformity, with a hint to those who have the framing of advertisements for apprehending offenders. The essay importantly looks at the tendency to presume a correspondence between character and appearance, what in practice often amounts to a presumption that physical deformity is a sign of moral deformity, and often that madness or idiocy will be legible on a person's body, the very marking that Lamb himself felt in the wake of the Day of Horrors. But Lamb's narrator Credo asserts these assumptions are incorrect. We often project onto others to the extent that we may even mistakenly ascribe disability to a person that we do not like. One example, Credo mistakenly remembered that someone of whom he had an ill opinion also had a very bad set of teeth. In reality, he did not. And Credo recalls thinking of that old crooked woman only to discover that he had confounded mental with bodily obliquity, and that there was nothing torturous about the old lady but her deeds. What Lamb describes in the essay are the processes by which a person becomes disabled, in its sense as a culturally contingent social role. As Credo shows us, an observer can interpret a visible sign of non-normative embodiment as a marker of moral or intellectual significance, or an observer can even imagine disability to match perceived ill character. The essay is much more complex than I can do justice to here, but it's worth a much longer look, and of course you can read my book to see more of my take on it. A second example that will allow me to show, again, my beloved cover from my 2016 book, which is of Samuel Horsey, is Lamb's complaint of the decay of beggars in the metropolis. In this essay, Lamb does several important things that illustrate his approach to disability. For one, he describes the social, cultural, and communal value of disabled beggars as he protests their removal from the city streets. He also describes their aesthetic value, as when he compares Samuel Horsey, who you see here on the slide, to the Parthenon marbles, also known as the Elgin marbles. The variety of the human body-mind really is incredible, and Lamb encourages us to appreciate it here, as elsewhere. And he does something similar in describing his gentle giantess and also his chimney sweepers. Characteristically, but remarkably, in his beggar essay, Lamb treats blind beggar as a social role as much as an embodied reality. Many of his contemporaries were concerned that beggars might feign disability to receive charity, and this was a justification for withholding charity, scrutinizing beggars before offering charity, or even removing beggars from the streets altogether. Lamb concludes his essay by suggesting that there is no meaningful difference to the spectator between actually blind beggars and blind beggars. Both perform the same valuable social role. He concludes the essay by asking the reader to shut not thy purse strings always against painted distress, act a charity sometimes. When a poor creature, outwardly and visibly such, comes before thee, rake not into the bowels of unwelcome truth to save a halfpenny. It is good to believe him. If he be not all that he pretendeth, give, and under a personate father of a family, think, if thou pleasest, that thou hast relieved an indigent bachelor. When they come with their counterfeit looks and mumping tones, think them players. You pay your money to see a comedian feign these things, which, concerning these poor people, thou canst not certainly tell whether they are feigned or not. Here we see Lamb having arrived at a distinct place in his approach to disability. For Lamb, disability as a social role is fully distinct from the physiological realities of blindness, madness, and other disabilities. But as Elia, he asserts a deep communal and philosophical, aesthetic, and religious value of that social role. I think I'm just going to keep switching between pronunciations, which was the one thing that I told myself not to do, of Elia. Blind beggars, even if some of them can actually see, are worth preserving. He acutely feels the loss of their presence as well as the loss of Samuel Horsey's remarkable form. And again, we can think back to Lamb's life here. Lamb's biography and his texts emphatically demonstrate that in defiance of stereotype, disability, even disabilities like Mary Lamb's and even disabilities like Samuel Horsey's, are not merely tragedy, even if Lamb's mother's death was an unmitigated tragedy. In Lamb's case, disability created the circumstances for one of the most important literary and social partnerships of the era, the one that he enjoyed with his sister Mary. And I'm not sure anyone could even claim, let alone begin to substantiate the claim, that Lamb's work would be at all what it is without having been directly informed by his experiences of disability and the influence of disability on his patterns of thought and wit. Remember, he timed his puns to his stammer. I said at the outset and in my abstract for this talk that Charles Lamb theorized disability. So far, I've only given you specific examples of discrete aspects of disability. I hope they have been compelling and convincing so far, and so far I hope that I've shown you how Lamb's approach is distinctly modern. But is this really theorizing disability? I'd say yes if we take Lamb's work as a whole. His was a project of constructing a variety of public selves, largely through his writing, but also through his sociability and the influence of being a disabled body-mind circulating in London. As we've already discussed, Lamb's public selves tended to foreground their disability, and Lamb often commented on dimensions of his own disability experience in addition to commenting on others' disabilities. Lamb's was an evolving approach to disability, but it was multifaceted, it was rich, it was ethically charged, and it was informed by deep personal experience. And if you're not there with me yet in thinking of Lamb as an early disability theorist, I hope we'll get there by the end, because I think the effect really is cumulative as you read more and more Lamb with an eye to disability and the ways that he describes various aspects of disability experience. So now on to Lamb and Crip time. And again, when you hear Crip time, think about Crip as community and Crip as identity claimed by disabled theorists, scholars, and activists in contemporary society. Here's biographer Eric Wilson on Lamb. Lamb hated watches. Lamb often did not date his letters, and he was always late for work. And here's Elia. What a dead thing is a clock, with its ponderous embowelments of lead and brass, its pert or solemn dullness of communication, compared with the simple altar-like structure and silent heart language of the old dial. And that's from the Old Benchers of the Inner Temple. The historical record tells us that after the Day of Horrors, the siblings began to develop a life according to the rhythms of Mary's mental illness, a time often fractured according to the unpredictability of those rhythms. Work on Crip time has pointed out how accommodating disability can require one to project into the future, to imagine and manage what might precipitate illness. This is one of the many ways that, as Ellen Samuels writes, Crip time is time travel. And the siblings also lived according to Lamb's disabled body-mind, the stammer according to which he timed his jokes, his own mental illness and alcohol use, which sometimes caused blackouts, and even the gait that formed his bodily rhythm on his prodigious urban walks. In the wake of the Day of Horrors, Charles Lamb seems to have experienced something akin to what Ellen Samuels describes as one of the other 6 ways of looking at Crip time, in addition to time travel. Crip time is grief time. It is a time of loss and of the crushing undertow that accompanies loss. I lost my mother when I was 20 and she was 52 to a cancer that she had lived with for 15 years. But those numbers don't say anything about the ways the days slowed and swelled unbearably around her death, or how the years piled up afterward, always too much, never enough. At best, Crip time is in friction with normative measured time, such as the time measured by the dead clock with its ponderous embowelments of lead and brass. At worst, Crip time and normative time are traumatically incompatible. Lamb's job at the East India Company required him to spend his days, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, year after year, and eventually decade after decade, according to normative time, the time of ledgers and offices, the time of empire. His letters in the wake of his mother's death suggest the slowing and swelling of time to accommodate his new reality. In writing about crypt time, Alison Kafer writes of how people with acquired impairments, for example, are described and often describe themselves as if they were multiple, as if there were two of them existing in different but parallel planes, the before disability and the after disability self, as if the distinction were always so clear, always so binary. Compulsory nostalgia is at work here, with a cultural expectation that the relationship between these two selves is always one of loss, and of loss that moves in only one direction. The after self longs for the time before, but not the other way around. We cannot imagine someone regaining the ability to walk, for example, only to miss the sensation of pushing a wheelchair or moving with crutches. And in a moment, I'll suggest that the way that we approach and read the Dream Children essay and also the essay, having trouble keeping the New Year's Eve, I can't remember the exact, I think it's just New Year's Eve, that essay. How we read those two essays, I think, demonstrates the pull that we as scholars and readers of Lamb often have to this narrative of compulsory nostalgia, reading Lamb as wishing for a future that he perhaps could have had he not been disabled, had Mary not been disabled. But I think that's more our own projection than it is something that we can identify in Lamb's essay. It's essays themselves. Okay, so we see this, we do see, I think, this before and after acquired impairment in Lamb's early responses to his mother's death. We get a distinct sense of before and after, for example, in his contributions to Blank Verse from 1798, which is a collection of poetry he collaborated on with Charles Lloyd, and that contains multiple, sometimes startlingly confessional poems about his experiences, including the poem written a year after the events. So we have the commemoration of time, suggesting that before and after break, and also written soon after the preceding poem. So a more relative conception of time, but still marking an anniversary, and then also written on Christmas Day, 1797. So again, a sort of before, after anniversary holiday sense of time. But more than the break between before and after, I'm interested in the ways that Lamb responds to his new reality. And in this context, we should also not forget that what is generally believed to have precipitated the events of September 1796 was a life already structured around crypt time and the pressures of caretaking. While also working, Mary was primary caretaker for the Lambs' two aged and infirm parents. Brother John recently had injured his leg, and their elderly Aunt Sarah also lived with them. And of course, the year before that, Charles Lamb had been institutionalized at Hoxton. In July 1798, Lamb writes to Robert Lloyd of Mary's latest institutionalization. "Do not imagine, Robert, that I sink under the misfortune. I have been seasoned to such events and think I could bear anything tolerably well." Most directly, Lamb is referring to the process by which he has already grown accustomed to what might otherwise cause more acute pain, less than 2 years after the Day of Horrors. But this being a sentence penned by Lamb, I can't help but think of the temporal inflections of season, how such events have already reordered Lamb's experience of the passing of time at a level as fundamental as the cycles of the seasons. Mary's latest institutionalization is perhaps equivalent in some way to a winter. The pattern has been established, if it will never quite align with measured time. They never quite know when Mary will fall ill again. Having become accustomed to the cycle, however, Lamb can bear the cold with greater fortitude, perhaps knowing that spring promises to come. If we tend to think of the Lamb's lives in terms of before and after, we do risk overlooking the continuities between the before and after, the fact that there was a caretaking ethos in the Lamb family before the Day of Horrors, for example. We also risk assessing the Lambs according to normative and ableist assumptions about life trajectories, that disability is the most seismic shift that one can experience, that it is only loss, that there is no recovering from the trauma of becoming disabled. Alison Kafer calls for disability studies to enter into theoretical discussions about time, temporality, and futurity, but also for us to wrestle with the ways in which the future has been deployed in the service of compulsory able-bodiedness and able-mindedness. Ideas about disability and disabled minds and bodies animate many of our collective evocations of the future. In these imaginings, disability too often serves as the agreed-upon limit of our projected futures. For those unable to imagine a future as a disabled person, the before and after of the day of horrors would seem intractable. For Kafer, crip futurity exists in stark contrast to the temporal framing more commonly applied to disability and disabled people, what she calls curative time. And she uses curative rather than cure to make it clear that she's concerned here with compulsory able-bodiedness and able-mindedness, not with individual sick and disabled people's relationships to a particular medical intervention. A desire for a cure is not necessarily anti-crip or anti-disability rights and justice. So what Kafer is speaking here is about a curative imaginary, an understanding of disability that not only expects and assumes intervention, but also that cannot imagine or comprehend anything other than intervention. Kafer writes that futurity often has been framed in curative terms, a time frame that casts disabled people as out of time or as obstacles to the arc of progress. If cured, by which Kafer means either a full cure or assimilation, a possibly formerly disabled person can play a starring role, the sign of progress, the proof of development, the triumph of mind over body. Mind or body. And in this frame of curative time, then, the only appropriate disabled mind body is one cured or moving towards cure. I've included these long quotes because in them, I think we can identify a new frame for interpreting Charles Lamb's decision to care for his sister, as well as his disagreement with his brother John about what course of action to take after the day of horrors. I also think Kafer provides a frame for reassessing some of the ways that Lamb has been interpreted by his contemporaries and also by generations since. Lamb's brother John may be said to have assessed Mary according to normative views of disability. Curative intervention was necessary, and there was no acceptable future that accommodated a disability such as hers. Perhaps because he had already experienced institutionalization himself, Charles Lamb seemed to have been able to imagine a different future for his sister. It entailed that he choose a life that diverged from compulsory able-bodiedness and heteronormative standards. But such are the choices that families continue to face in societies with limited care choices. And I also wanted to give you a quote from Alison Kafer, building on Judith Halberstam. She writes, normative narratives of time presume a linear development from dependent childhood to an independent adulthood defined by marriage and reproduction. And I think we see this narrative, this normative narrative, the very strong pull of it in our interpretations of Lamb. And to my mind, this curative logic, this normative logic, has distorted our sense of Lamb's choice to live with Mary about the possible future scholars often say that he gave up for his sister. A disability studies reading of Lamb's biography would conclude that he is not a saint and he is not a martyr for caring for Mary. If anything, he is able to more accurately assess the situation in which Mary and her family have found themselves and is able to work to advocate for and provide more appropriate and humane care for his sister. And more recent scholarship on Lamb has called attention rightfully to what Lamb gained from the situation, although I do still think that there is a tendency, at least a latent one, to pathologize the circumstances in which the Lamb siblings lived. Hence, we have occasional claims of incestuous desire still between Charles and Mary, and hence we have claims of Lamb desiring their adopted daughter, Emma. We have trouble fully embracing the idea that Charles Lamb could have chosen a life path that was this different from the ways that we tend to, in normative systems, think about our futures. The Lamb's childlessness that neither married, their mutual caretaking, these are still often seen as tragedies rather than reasonable or valuable choices. One of the problems with curative logic is that it can lead to what Kafer calls an ethics of endless deferral. By pouring resources, financial, practical, emotional, into cure, we divert our attention from the here and now and the accommodations and lives that could, with a shift in frame, be improved in the present, often in such a way that better futures might be possible. In this context, we may visit the repetition and circularity of Lamb's 1798 confessional poems. They bespeak trauma, as my former graduate student Todd Osborne has written about, but in their circularity and repetition, they may be also said to resist progressive curative logic. What can one do, Lamb asks, if one does not fix on an impossible future, but instead tries to come to terms with what is? In this context, it is likewise compelling that Lamb uses the word prop to describe his relationship with Mary. When in an asylum, he misses her as a prop. In May 1800, he wrote, "My daily and hourly prop has fallen from me. I totter and stagger with weakness, for nobody can supply her place to me." In a disability studies context, this suggests that Mary is for him a kind of prosthetic, that her role in his life is also as a caretaker to his disabled body-mind, just as that is his role for her. It is a metaphor of disability that is used to describe a relationship between two disabled people, one that is especially vivid if we keep in mind Lamb's irregular gait, and that he knew what it was to totter and to fall. Disability studies scholars remind us, moreover, that crutches and wheelchairs and other access tools are really symbols of accessibility and movement and accommodation. They're not symbols of deficit. You might still hear people say or see people write that someone is wheelchair bound, but disability activists and disability scholars will quickly offer a corrective. Here's Simi Linton. The various terms such as wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair imply that a wheelchair restricts the individual, holds a person prisoner. Disabled people are more likely to say that someone uses a wheelchair. The latter phrase not only indicates the active nature of the user and the positive way that wheelchairs increase mobility and activity, but recognizes that people get in and out of wheelchairs for different activities. If we can read fear and possibly melancholy in Lamb's use of the word prop here, we know of his fears that Mary would die before him, and also that she would perhaps never come out of one of her periods of madness. We can also recognize here that he figures her as someone who granted him access and accommodation, just as he did her. Lamb wrote of Elia and Bridget's double singleness, and Wordsworth wrote of Charles and Mary as a double tree with two collateral stems sprung from one root. And again, we have this very embodied physical image of the two holding each other up there in Wordsworth's figuration. Mary was, biographer Eric Wilson writes, his sister, yes, but also mentor, friend, literary collaborator, and in effect, wife. I'd resist calling her wife because of that sort of compulsory heteronormative future progress that we all grew up feeling the pressure of, to be born, to grow up and become independent, to get married, to have children, and then potentially to enter into a state of dependency again. So I want to resist that by comparing Mary to a wife, but at least that comparison of Mary to a wife suggests how very much Lamb gained by his choice to live with Mary and how much positive there was in that compatible symbiotic relationship by which each of them held the other up. And now I want to turn briefly, and here's where it's going to get a little bit messy, so my apologies in advance, to Lamb's essay on time, in which he describes himself in ways that tend to the crip. Some of his qualities are hidden by asterisks, so we don't know what he is addicted to, although readers of Lamb can guess. Even his contemporaries could guess what he's talking about. This is, after all, after the first publication of Confessions of a Drunkard. It might be unclear for a reader unacquainted with Elia that a stammering buffoon references Lamb's speech impediment, but that embodied in detail appears so frequently throughout this that it can be taken as clear reference to Lamb's disability. And we also see the pathologizing language as Elia describes his particular kind of retrospection as a symptom, perhaps, of some sickly idiosyncrasy. But Lamb's use of medical discourse here, as elsewhere, feels to me to be a deliberate marking of Elia as the sort whose thought patterns would interest a medical professional and perhaps concern a medical professional. And his recollection of his childhood in the New Year's Eve essay is a recollection of illness. He had smallpox at 5 and laying his poor fevered head upon the sick pillow at Christ's. So disability is sometimes latent and sometimes very explicit throughout this essay. And this is, of course, an essay on time. And most accept that Lamb's bachelorhood did have to do with his partnership with Mary and his decision to keep her out of permanent institutional care for what was in effect an episodic illness. And we see an expression of this possibility potentially in this essay. He describes that perhaps it is not a sickly symptom that he is retrospective in the ways that he is, but perhaps it's due to the fact that being without wife or family, I have not learned to project myself enough out of myself. Having no offspring of my own to dally with, I turn back upon memory and adopt my own early idea as my errand favorite. So instead of looking to his children to imagine future, he looks to his former self to imagine the futures that could have been and that weren't. And again, most people think that the reason his present ended up where it ended up was because of his partnership with Mary. And Eric Wilson, the biographer, has suggested that he may have been thwarted in his romantic attempts because people worried about the insanity that seemed to run in his family. And I certainly would think that Lamb would have experienced those pressures, especially because he was so attuned to that feeling of being marked. But I do not feel in the New Year's Eve essay the longing that I would expect to feel if he were really mourning a lost future that he wished that he could have had. Instead, what I see is someone who is able to, or has developed a different relationship to time so that he's able to project into the future by looking backwards. It is an embodiment of what Ellen Samuels describes as crypt time being time travel. So he comments on how there is that heteronormative expectation that one is expected to procreate, and that this shapes our ideas of the present, the past, and particularly our prospective futures. But this is a system that he is outside of. And Susan Wendell, who I quoted earlier, has noted of disability experience that oftentimes disabled people, because they exist outside of the systems that don't accept their being, essentially, that they are able to critique those systems in ways that other people are not. Other examples of this in Lamb that don't have so much to do with time, for the most part, are his complaint on the behavior of married people and on modern gallantry. He is able to see through these heteronormative systems and expectations in ways that perhaps someone caught in the system might not. But again, my interest in this context is largely, I think, our potential misreading of Lamb as being really longing for a future that he could not have had, rather than reading the potential that he has chosen to embrace in his life with Mary. And another place that I have to at least mention is the end of the Dream Children Reverie, because this is another place that people look to in claiming that Lamb mourned for the future that he could have perhaps had he not been disabled. But I do not personally read any mourning as these dream children recede. And I know that there are a few people in the audience who have not read this essay, but in this essay, Elia imagines at the beginning that he's talking to his 2 children, but at the very end, throughout, he is talking about his own family of origin and thinking about his childhood. And this is where that lame-footed boy comment comes from. At the end, the children dissolve. they tell him, we are nothing less than nothing and dreams. We are only what might have been. And the might have been, I think we should read as might have been had life gone differently. And we can't but think of disability here. And must wait upon the tedious shores of Lethe, millions of ages before we have existence and a name. And immediately awakening, I, Elia, found myself quietly seated in my bachelor armchair, where I had fallen asleep with the faithful Bridget unchanged by my side, but John L. or James Elia was gone forever. I don't feel longing here. I just don't. And I think that the tendency to feel longing here is perhaps born of those normative narratives and curative logic that we ourselves have been socialized according to. The longing that I do feel here is for his brother John, who had died, Lamb's brother John. That is the loss that he feels, and he ends with. And the stability of faithful Bridget is who remains by his side. So there are plenty of other ways that I want to think about Lamb and time, and this extemporaneous bit of the talk is a clear signal to you, hopefully, that this is all very, very new work that I have been thinking about for a very long time, but I'm just starting to write about. But I think Lamb's really brilliant explorations of time are one of the reasons that I really do think he is theorizing disability, because he is engaging so many of the topics that contemporary disability theorists, disability activists are writing about and are thinking about, and he speaks to us so much in the present day in terms that I think that we can understand if we have the language to name it. I said that I was going to very briefly mention some of the connections I'm thinking about with Lamb and race. And, obviously, I think there is no way to avoid thinking about race if I'm making the claim that we have to think about race and disability together, and also calling Charles Lamb perhaps one of the first theorists of modern disability. We have to think about Lamb and race, not least because he worked at the East India Company for decades, that sort of, that machine of empire and that caused so much violence and death to non-white people. He also was personal friends with abolitionists and offers really complex depictions of race that I think share in some instances commonalities with his depictions of disability. I'm thinking here of imperfect sympathies, the ways that I think that he demonstrates aesthetic judgments to be problematic at best, you could say. I also am really interested in his chimney sweeper essay and the ways that he links chimney sweeper bodies to Black bodies, which was not, certainly an unheard of association, but the way that he does it, I think that he calls attention to the really unusual position that enslaved people were in, that they had in common with chimney sweepers, which is to say that being an enslaved person, you were always already on the brink of disability if you were not already disabled because of the conditions of labor. And the same could be said of the chimney sweepers. And most people who wrote about chimney sweepers were not as explicit on that point. And I think Charles Lamb really calls attention to the chimney sweepers as always already disabled. And that's why they have a place in my book chapter from my old book. So I do want to end by very quickly thinking about Charles Lamb and Crip Futures. I told you at the outset that I was going to suggest why it matters for us to call Charles Lamb and Coleridge and other people who lived 200 years ago disabled, and how that could matter. And I want to end with a few quotes and a few remarks on these quotes. I will try not to end on too depressing of a note, though. I will warn you that some of the things that I'm going to mention are a bit distressing to me as a scholar of disability. Alison Kafer writes of her amazing book, Feminist Queer Crip, that she's written it because she desires Crip futures, futures that embrace disabled people, futures that imagine disability differently, futures that support multiple ways of being. I use this language of desire deliberately. I know how my heart can catch when I see a body that moves oddly or bears strange scars. I know how my body shifts, lean forward when I hear someone speak with atypical pauses or phrasing, or when talk turns to illness and disability. Part of what I'm describing is a lust born of recognition, a lust to see bodies like my own or like the bodies of friends and lovers, as well as a hope that the other finds such recognition in me. And for those who are well acquainted with Lamb, you might be thinking already of something that he wrote to Wordsworth in 1822, that common natures do not suffice me. Good people, as they are called, won't serve. I want individuals. I am made up of queer points, and I want so many answering needles. I think the sentiment driving both of these quotes is almost exactly the same: a desire for the peculiar, a desire for disability, a desire to be seen by another person who not only is potentially disabled, but recognizes and desires that disability in the other person. And this requires creative work of sort of resisting these curative logics and future as we are led to believe it should be. This requires us to seek out peculiarity, as Lamb did, and as Wordsworth did, I think, also, and as Kafer asks us to do in the present day. And in 2016, in the United States, there was a study that showed that almost 1 in 5 students self-identified as disabled. I think it was 19%. And I think after COVID, there's suggestion that that number has gone up significantly, especially in the category of mental illness. And so calling someone like Charles Lamb disabled sort of allows us to present to our students a queer point for their answering needles. It allows them also to think of Charles Lamb as what a disability studies scholar might call a crip ancestor. And Stacy Milburn writes about crip ancestorship, that ancestorship, like love, is expansive and breaks man-made boundaries cast upon it, like the nuclear family model or artificial nation-state borders. Many disabled people are born to families not of other disabled people, and so they have to look to the past, and they have to look beyond their nuclear families a lot of the time to find models of disability. And I think we have the opportunity in looking at and teaching romantic literature, reading romantic literature, to offer these crip ancestors, to offer these queer points to our answering needles, to our students' answering needles. And the thing that I want to end with, even though it's a little bit depressing, is Kafer's call that we need to imagine crip futures, because disabled people are continually being written out of the future, rendered as the sign of the future no one wants. The erasure is not mere metaphor. It is my loss, our loss, not to take care of, embrace, and desire all of us. We must begin to anticipate presence and to imagine futures that include all of us. We must explore disability in time. And while it's wonderful that so many of our students are identifying as disabled and disability activism is so vibrant right now, there's also cause for real concern in our present moment. We can look to the COVID pandemic, and in the United States, our then CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, pretty famously within disability circles, said at one point that it was very encouraging that the people who were still dying of COVID after the vaccines became available were people who had multiple health problems, to which disability studies scholars said that is not encouraging, that is terrible. And I think Lamb would think that was terrible too. There are similarly very eugenic things happening in Canada. We have reports of disabled people who seek accommodations, and once they can't find accommodations, they apply for assisted suicide. And again, Kafer would say, no, this cannot be the best way, and Lamb would say that too. And part of why I think Lamb is so important in the present moment is that in his life, he created a model of a different way of being, a way of appreciating disability, of desiring the disability around him, of caretaking, of duty, of an ethics of care. And I think that he would be a really good model for all of us to look to as we resist, the equivalent for him of taking the disabled beggars from the streets. He can help us to meet this moment and try to imagine futures that are more accessible, that are more full of Charles Lambs and Mary Lamb. lambs than they might be otherwise. So I'm sorry to end on an extemporized note, but thank you so much for listening to my thoughts, winding and partly formed as they were, especially towards the end.
Thank you so much, Emily, and certainly not unformed, though they opened up so many brilliant questions for us. Thank you. I'll be thinking about the points you make for a long time to come. I loved that reading of Lamb, not simply as a disabled writer, but as an early disabled theorist, and thinking about the ways in which we can view him through that lens of disability and open up different points in his work. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we're all applauding us. I wonder whether I could open it up for questions. And do feel free to put questions in the chat, to raise your hand, just to come in with any comments if you'd like, but just let me know if I haven't spotted you.